The Night in Captivity. As evening fell, the farmhouse command post grew quieter. The constant movement of soldiers slowed. Radios still crackled in the other rooms, but the intense activity of the afternoon had faded into a tense silence. The prisoners sat alone on a wooden chair inside a small room with a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. Outside the door, 2 German guards stood watch. For the first time since the encounter in the forest, he finally had a moment to think. Not about fear, but about time. In war, time is often more valuable than weapons. Every hour that passed gave his fellow soldiers more distance, more safety, more opportunity to deliver their report and prepare for whatever operation might come next. And that thought alone made the situation easier to endure. The Germans still wanted answers. Later that night, the door opened again. The older German officer entered, carrying a small notebook. He pulled up a chair and sat across from the prisoner. This time, the questioning was slower and more deliberate. Instead of repeating the same questions, the officer began connecting details from earlier conversations. He mentioned the forest patrol, the footprints, the strange behavior of the man who had walked out of hiding. Then he asked a direct question. Why did you step out? For a moment, the room remained silent. It was an unusual question because it wasn't about military information. It was about the decision itself. The prisoner could have invented another story. He could have continued pretending that he was lost or separated from his unit. But instead, he simply said something simple. Someone had to. The officer stared at him for several seconds. In that moment, he likely understood the truth. The man sitting in front of him had sacrificed his own freedom so others could escape. And even in war, soldiers sometimes recognize courage, even in their enemies. A war already beginning to change. Outside the farmhouse, the larger war was moving in a direction the German army could no longer fully control. By this stage of World War II, Germany was facing enormous pressure on multiple fronts. Allied forces were advancing, supply lines were weakening, and the once unstoppable German war machine was beginning to show cracks. But soldiers in the field often didn't see the entire picture. They only saw the next mission, the next patrol, the next prisoner. For them, the war continued one small moment at a time. And tonight, that moment centered on the captured soldier sitting in the small farmhouse room. The possibility of transfer. The following morning brought new orders. German command posts often moved prisoners to larger facilities for longer interrogations. Officers trained specifically in intelligence gathering would take over questioning. The guards informed him that he might soon be transferred to another location. For many prisoners, that journey was the beginning of months, sometimes years, in prison camps. But the soldier remained focused on the one fact that mattered most. The mission had succeeded. Whatever happened next, the decision he made in the forest had already achieved its purpose. The soldiers who escaped never forgot. Days later, far from that farmhouse, the men who escaped gathered with their commanding officers to discuss what had happened. They described the moment in the forest, the German patrol approaching, the sudden decision of their comrade to step out of hiding. At first, the officers listening to the story were stunned. It was the kind of action rarely written in official reports because it relied entirely on personal courage rather than formal orders. But the result was undeniable. The patrol routes had been exposed, enemy movements had been confirmed, and an important piece of intelligence had reached Allied command. One officer finally said something that captured the entire story. He saved the mission. The power of the unexpected. In war, strategy often focuses on numbers. More soldiers, more tanks, more weapons. But moments like this remind us that human decisions can sometimes matter as much as military strength. The German patrol expected enemies to hide or run. They expected fear. They did not expect a man to walk directly toward them and calmly start a conversation. That single unexpected decision changed the outcome of the encounter. And sometimes in war, surprise is the most powerful weapon of all. A story that lives beyond the battlefield. Years later, when the war finally ended, many stories of courage began to surface. Some involved massive battles. Others described famous generals. But some of the most powerful stories were much quieter. Moments where one person made a choice that protected others. This was one of those stories. Surrounded by German soldiers, facing almost certain capture, he made a decision that no one expected. He stepped forward, not to fight, not to escape, but to give others the chance to survive. And because of that choice, the mission and the men behind him lived on. What became of the soldier? The days after his capture passed slowly. The Germans kept him under guard, moving him between small temporary posts as the front lines continued shifting. Interrogations continued, but they produced little useful information. Every officer who questioned him eventually reached the same conclusion. He knew something, but he was not going to reveal it. In many cases during World War II, prisoners like him were eventually transferred to larger detention camps deeper behind the front lines. These camps held thousands of captured soldiers from different Allied armies. Life in those camps was difficult. Food was limited, conditions were harsh, and the uncertainty of the war made every day feel longer than the last. Yet, compared to the battlefield, the camps also meant something important: survival. For many captured soldiers, being held as a prisoner of war meant they had at least escaped the constant danger of artillery, air attacks, and frontline combat. The war outside the camp. While he remained in captivity, the war outside continued to move quickly. Across Europe, the balance of power was changing. Allied forces were advancing across multiple fronts. German units were being pushed back step by step, losing territory they had once conquered with speed and confidence. Supply shortages began to affect German troops. Fuel became scarce. Vehicles broke down more often. Communication between units grew more difficult. What had once seemed like an unstoppable military force was slowly weakening, and every new Allied advance brought one important possibility for prisoners held inside German camps: liberation. The day when everything changed. For months, the prisoner heard distant sounds of war. Sometimes it was artillery far away, sometimes the low rumble of aircraft passing overhead. The guards grew more nervous with each passing week. Rumors spread among prisoners that Allied forces were moving closer to the region. Then, one morning, the sound came again, but this time it was louder. Artillery explosions echoed in the distance. German soldiers rushed through the camp, shouting orders and moving equipment. Something major was happening. Within hours, the guards began to prepare to move prisoners away from the area. Many camps were evacuated during the final stages of the war as German forces tried to prevent prisoners from being freed by Allied advancing armies. But events were moving too fast. Before the transfer could begin, Allied troops reached the area. The fighting around the camp was brief but intense, and when it ended, the gates were opened. For many prisoners, it was the first moment of real freedom they had experienced in months. Freedom after the war. When the soldier finally stepped outside the camp as a free man, the world looked very different from the one he had known before the war. Entire cities had been damaged or destroyed. Millions of people across Europe were trying to rebuild their lives after years of conflict. But for him, the most important thing was simple: he had survived. Eventually, he reunited with fellow soldiers and returned home. Stories of the war were shared slowly over time, sometimes with friends, sometimes with historians who wanted to understand what had happened during those chaotic years. Among those stories was the moment in the forest. the moment when he stepped out of hiding and walked directly toward a German patrol. Why his decision still matters. Many heroes of war are remembered because of large battles or famous victories, but sometimes the most powerful acts of courage happen in small, quiet moments that almost no one sees. A decision made in seconds, a risk taken without hesitation, a sacrifice made so others could escape. When the German patrols surrounded that forest path, most soldiers would have tried to run. He did something different. He stepped forward, and by doing so, he created the confusion that allowed his comrades to escape and complete their mission. The lesson from that moment. War is often described through weapons, strategies, and military strength. But stories like this remind us that wars are also shaped by individual choices. One person, one moment, one... In the early 20th century, Europe stood at the height of its power. Industrial cities were growing rapidly, empires stretched across continents, and technological advancements were transforming society. But beneath this progress, a dangerous tension was building. Powerful nations like Germany, Britain, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary were competing for influence, territory, and military strength. They were forming alliances, expanding their armies, and preparing for a war many believed was inevitable. Officially, Europe was at peace, but behind closed doors, governments and military leaders were secretly planning for a massive conflict. When World War I finally began in 1914, it shocked the world. Yet, for many generals and politicians, the war had already been planned years before. These were the secret plans that helped start World War I. Europe on the edge of war. By the early 1900s, Europe was divided into two powerful alliance systems. The first was the Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, which included Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were supposed to maintain peace by balancing power. However, they also created a dangerous situation. If one country went to war, its allies would be pulled into the conflict. This meant that a small regional dispute could quickly escalate into a continent-wide war. And because each nation expected war to come sooner or later, they began preparing detailed military strategies in secret. Germany's master plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Germany faced a serious strategic problem. If war broke out, Germany would have to fight two powerful enemies at the same time, France in the west and Russia in the east. German military leaders believed fighting on two fronts would be extremely dangerous. To solve this problem, German General Alfred von Schlieffen created a bold and ambitious strategy. The plan was simple in theory. Germany would first launch a massive, lightning-fast attack against France. Instead of attacking directly across the border, German forces would move through the neutral country of Belgium. By sweeping around French defenses and quickly capturing Paris, Germany hoped to defeat France within weeks. After that, German forces would shift eastward to fight Russia, whose army was expected to mobilize slowly. This strategy depended on speed, precision, and surprise. But it also had a huge risk. Invading Belgium could bring Britain into the war. Despite this danger, Germany decided the plan was worth the risk. France's Plan 17. France also had its own secret military strategy. This plan was known as Plan 17. France had never forgotten the humiliation of losing the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. French military leaders believed that the best strategy was to attack aggressively and reclaim these lost lands. Plan 17 focused on launching a rapid offensive into German territory. French commanders believed that courage, determination, and offensive spirit would overcome the enemy. However, they underestimated the strength of German defenses and the deadly power of modern weapons, such as machine guns and heavy artillery. Russia's war preparations. Russia possessed one of the largest armies in the world, but it also had major weaknesses. Its railways were limited, its supply systems were inefficient, and mobilizing millions of soldiers took a long time. Despite these challenges, Russia had a clear strategy. If war broke out, Russia would mobilize its massive army and attack Germany from the east. This would force Germany to divide its forces between two fronts, giving France a better chance of surviving in the west. Russia also promised to defend Serbia if it came under attack from Austria-Hungary. This promise would soon prove critical. Britain's quiet military planning. Britain did not officially commit to a detailed war plan like Germany or France. However, British military leaders had quietly prepared for the possibility of conflict. Britain maintained the most powerful navy in the world. Its main goal was to protect trade routes and maintain control of the seas. In case of war with Germany, Britain planned to use its navy to blockade German ports. This would cut off Germany's supplies and weaken its economy. Britain also planned to send a small but highly trained force known as the British Expeditionary Force to assist France if war broke out. Although Britain had not formally promised to join a war, these preparations showed that the country was ready. The spark, the assassination in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, a dramatic event took place in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was visiting the region of Bosnia. A group of Serbian nationalists known as the Black Hand had planned to assassinate him. One of the conspirators, a young man named Gavrilo Princip, managed to shoot the Archduke and his wife as their car passed through the city. The assassination shocked Europe, but more importantly, it triggered the chain reaction that military leaders had long prepared for. Austria-Hungary's decision. Austria-Hungary believed that Serbia was responsible for the assassination. Before taking action, Austria sought support from its powerful ally, Germany. Germany responded by offering full backing to Austria-Hungary. Historians later called this the blank check. With German support guaranteed, Austria-Hungary sent a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia agreed to most of the demands but refused to accept all of them. For Austria-Hungary, this was enough justification for war. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The domino effect. Once the first declaration of war was made, the alliance system quickly pulled the rest of Europe into the conflict. Russia began mobilizing its army to defend Serbia. Germany viewed this mobilization as a direct threat and declared war on Russia. Soon after, Germany declared war on France. Following the Schlieffen Plan, German troops invaded Belgium to reach France. Belgium's neutrality had been guaranteed by Britain. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, the British government faced a difficult decision. Some politicians hoped Britain could stay out of the conflict, but others believed that allowing Germany to dominate Europe would threaten British security and power. On August 4, 1914, Britain officially declared war on Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, though small compared to other armies, was highly trained and professional. British soldiers were quickly sent to France to join the fighting. With Britain now involved, the conflict was no longer just a European war. Because of the British Empire, countries and colonies from around the world would soon be drawn into the fighting. The war spreads across the world. As the major European powers entered the conflict, their colonies and allies followed. Soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Africa joined the war effort. The Ottoman Empire eventually joined the Central Powers, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, Japan joined the Allies and attacked German territories in Asia. What had begun as a regional conflict in Europe quickly turned into a global war. Battles were fought not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. For the first time in history, war truly became worldwide. The Western Front stalemate. Germany's plan to quickly defeat France began to fail. In September 1914, German forces approached Paris, but French and British troops launched a powerful counterattack during the First Battle of the Marne. The German advance was finally stopped. After this battle, both sides began digging long defensive trenches. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. This became known as the Western Front. Life in the trenches was brutal. Soldiers lived in mud, cold, and constant danger from artillery and machine guns. Battles often lasted months, yet gained only a few miles of territory. The war that was expected to end quickly had turned into a long and deadly stalemate. The Eastern Front. While the Western Front became locked in trench warfare, the Eastern Front was much more fluid. Russia launched major attacks against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Early in the war, Russian forces invaded East Prussia. However, German commanders quickly responded. In the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, German forces surrounded and destroyed a large Russian army. Despite this victory, fighting in the East continued for years. The Eastern Front stretched across vast territories, and millions of soldiers fought in massive battles. Russia suffered enormous losses, which eventually contributed to political unrest at home. New technology and the horrors of modern war. World War I introduced terrifying new weapons and technologies. Machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, making direct attacks incredibly deadly. Heavy artillery shells destroyed entire battlefields and caused massive casualties. Poison gas was introduced, creating horrific injuries and panic among soldiers. Later in the war, tanks and airplanes began appearing on the battlefield. These technologies changed warfare forever. The secret military plans created before the war had not fully prepared armies for the destructive power of these modern weapons. As a result, the war became far more brutal than anyone had imagined. The war that changed the world. By the time the war finally ended in 1918, the consequences were devastating. Over 16 million people had lost their lives. 4 major empires collapsed: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. New countries were created, borders were redrawn, and the balance of power in Europe was permanently changed. But perhaps the most important consequence was that the peace that followed the war would eventually lead to another global conflict just 2 decades later. When the war began in 1914, many leaders believed it would end